Welcome to It's Time to Audit, Every State, Every Election. Please welcome Cully Stimson, Senior Legal Fellow and Deputy Director in the Heritage Foundation's Meese Center.
Well, welcome to Heritage, to those of you here in the audience and the people who are joining us virtually around the country. With the election less than 3 weeks away, it's important to remember that it is essential to preserving our democratic republic that we have secure elections in which every citizen who is eligible to vote is able to cast a ballot. And that vote is not lost or voided or stolen due to errors, mistakes, technology failures, or fraud. We need to ensure at least 3 things. 1, all applicable laws and regulations that apply to voting are complied with. 2, public taxpayer funds are properly spent on the administration of the election. And 3, that election officials take all the steps necessary before, during, and after the election to guarantee the integrity of the entire process from when an individual first registers to vote to the final tabulation and results being officially certified and announced to voters, candidates, and the media. We want a process in which, when it's over, everyone agrees, even the candidates who lost and their supporters, that we had a fair and honest election. So how do we do that? That's the question today. And it begs the question, are comprehensive election audits a way to achieve that goal? In-depth audits of elections are almost non-existent. Yet in-depth financial and accounting audits are standard practices in the rest of America with businesses, charities, and many other organizations. Heritage has published a new study explaining this issue, available online. It's called Best Practices and Standards for Election Audits. I encourage you to read it or download it. Today we have 3 experts with us to discuss this very important question. The Honorable Senator Paul Bettencourt is a graduate of Texas A&M.
Whoop!
And the president and
That's
CEO
called a whoop, sorry.
A tax consulting company. He has been in the Texas Senate since 2014, representing Senate District 7,
Right.
which encompasses most of West Harris County and parts of Montgomery County. He chairs the Senate Committee on Local Government, serves on the Finance, Education, Criminal Justice, and State Affairs Committees, and has won numerous awards for his work as a legislator, including the Legislative Legacy Award from the Texas Public Policy Foundation, the former home of our president here at Heritage now, Dr. Kevin Roberts. Before he moved to the Texas legislature, Senator Bettencourt was the tax assessor collector for Harris County. I'm sure that was a very popular position, which includes most of Houston for 10 years.
Right.
In Texas, that is the county official responsible for voter registration and other
It
elected.
was only popular because I was for a tax cut at the time.
Go tax cuts.
You got it.
And he was very busy there cleaning up the voter registration of dead voters and felons who were ineligible to vote, as well as finding aliens who were illegally registered to vote. Since he has not only run for election, he has administered elections, which gives him a lot of insight and experience on how to improve the election process. We welcome you to Heritage. Apparently you have a motto. It's what gets measured gets fixed.
Absolutely.
So he was the primary author of the Texas Senate Audit Bill, as well as one of the first joint authors of the Texas Election Reform Bill, which was titled SB 1. Next to Paul is Chad Ennis. Texas is one of the only states in the nation to have passed a law requiring audits of a set number of counties after every election, and the bill Senator Bettencourt authored in the Senate. Chad Ennis is the first director of the brand new Forensic Audit Division in the Office of the Texas Secretary of State, which is run by John Scott. So he is in the midst of creating the standards and practices that Texas will follow in conducting those audits. He was a senior fellow for election integrity at the Texas Public Policy Foundation before he moved to the Secretary's office. He has been in private practice, but also was a federal prosecutor in Louisiana and an assistant attorney general in the office of the Texas Attorney General. He received his law degree with honors from the University of Texas and an engineering degree from the University of Missouri. My colleague Hans von Spakovsky also works in the Edwin Meese III Center for Legal and Judicial Studies, where he serves as the manager of the Election Law Reform Initiative. He has 3 decades of experience in elections, both as a lawyer and an election official. He served on the Federal Election Commission for 2 years, was the counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights in the United States Department of Justice, and has served on county election boards in both Georgia and Virginia, responsible for administering elections in the 2 largest counties in both states. He's the author of numerous books, articles, and studies on election issues, and is a graduate of MIT and the Vanderbilt School of Law. So the format for today is that each of my colleagues will give a short opening statement or presentation. We'll go left to right here, and then we'll have a moderated discussion, and then we'll open up the floor to your questions. Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Cully. My interest in audits really started when I was a tax assessor collector, and you wonder how we were involved. Well, because we, in the past, collected what was an abomination, which was the poll tax. So in Texas, the voter registrars were the tax assessor collectors, and the county clerks were the folks that were administering the election. So I got into office and followed a person that had been in office 51 years and an odd number of months and days. He had gone to work for the tax office when Roosevelt was president, and that was Teddy. No, it was Franklin, not Teddy. So office was very antiquated. And we looked at the voter roll list, and we found there were 50,000 deceased and felon registrations on a list of less than 2 million. We started trying to call those off, if you pardon the pun. And what we did was, by sending out confirmation notices, we got back notices from family members that the person was registered, had voted in the 1990s, but had died in 1964. Hundreds of letters like that. Somebody was incarcerated in Huntsville, which is our main state prison. I went to the DA, legendary Johnny Holmes, with his handlebar mustache, and he said, "Paul, that man is not voting in Houston, I can guarantee you." And he was correct. It was somebody else that was voting for him. There were 500 of those. Now, in the 2000 presidential election, if you remember, what was the margin of victory in Florida?
537 votes.
You got it, because you might have been there. So Harris County by itself could have determined the fate of the national election, because we had let people, the voter roll go completely fallow. So what gets measured gets fixed. Clean that up. And that started my focus on voter roll integrity. Because if the voter roll has integrity, the election outcome is less likely to be contested. I did do some presentations up here in the House Administration Committee in the decade following that, because I thought that photo ID was a way to solve a lot of problems if we could check a citizenship list, because most people don't know we don't have one in the United States. Solves a lot of problems and gets past a lot of arguments. When I get elected Senate, this has always been an interest of mine to look at what's happening with the voter rolls, and we had a unique problem in Harris County that in October of 2020, the early vote totals didn't match. And as a former election administrator, you could see the numbers. They weren't matching, and it was off by over 10,000. And I started asking questions. Then the Secretary of State started asking questions. But the newly appointed county clerk didn't have to answer, and didn't. In fact, one night they changed the results, and then it still didn't match. So on the floor of the Senate, I used a complaint letter that's pretty factual, and from a lawyer, Rachel Huber Esquire, talking about how we knew there was 1,884 more votes on the county voter than the county voter roster. It means we had more votes than names. Now, that wasn't just Harris County, because we went around the state and there were 1,300 extra votes that didn't make the voter roll in Williamson County. In Wichita County, Wichita Falls, Texas, there's a single-family residence that had 579 people registered at it and 179 voted. I'm not really sure where the other 400 were, but they obviously missed the election, okay? So it became apparent that as part of SB1 that we needed to have, first off, citizenship checks, which are in there, then also audit capability, which is what has launched the audit, the forensic audit division. And I'm not talking just a limited purpose audit. You have to get into the details. One of the more humorous details in my audit bill was if there's more votes in a precinct than there are registered voters, you have a problem. And we had more than a dozen of those precincts. Now, what it all means is simply this. If you have an audit capability, you can find out what went wrong. See, in the swirl of the froth of national politics now, just asking a question can get you labeled an election denier. But you should be able to ask questions to get answers. When I was a voter registrar, I had to answer every question that came to me. I had to say, why is this registration here? Why is it deleted? We need to get back to being able to do that. So the beginning of the forensic audit division is just a start, because I think that we need to expand it not just to random audits, but when there are clear issues in the field, you should be able to ask an election administrator, what's the truth? What's the facts? Get an answer. If you're not satisfied, great. You make sure that you haven't missed an obvious detail, and then give it to the Secretary of State or whatever the chief elections officer is in any state, the opportunity to say, that's it, we're going to order an audit. Because you're right. In the business community, audits are ubiquitous. You live off them. And it's not just the fact that they're accepted. It's an absolute must. So I am absolutely committed, and I know the Texas Senate has passed an upgraded version of the audit bill twice, and I can't speak for all my colleagues, but I believe that Lieutenant Governor also supports it, and I think we'll have a good chance to have even further work done in Texas. It's simple. What gets measured gets fixed. When you find a problem, fix it. Tell the public about it. Don't be ashamed. Don't get caught up in election denier, debates. Fix the problem, move on, and tell the public the truth about their election process.
Thank you, Paul. Chad, you're in the catbird seat now. You're the guy.
Yes.
Tell us about this experience.
Congratulations.
Be careful when you go testify in front of Senator Bettencourt. He may create a job for you, and you end up as the director of the audit division. But it's a very interesting challenge to start something like this from scratch. The day I got there, there weren't pens in my office. I had nothing. I didn't have a piece of paper to write on, and not to mention a list of what I'm supposed to be doing. So I think we spent probably 2-3 months getting our arms around, Senator has told us to audit. What does that mean? What can we look at meaningfully where we can help the process and we can make sure that the processes get better and problems are getting fixed? So, and what's interesting about that is Texas is, as you guys have probably heard, a big state. We have 254 counties, and we have 254 ways of doing things. I think that's a strength. Because Loving County with 100 voters is not the same as Harris County with 2 million voters. Those are different. So they've got to do things differently. But from my perspective, when you get in my seat, well, what records is everyone going to have? Well, it gets a little different between what Harris County has and what Loving County, for example, has. I won't pick on Loving anymore or Harris anymore. So we really tried to get our arms around what are they required to keep, so what are we sure they should have? And then what are the folks doing also in the counties, records-wise, that we can audit? And, step one in any of these audits has to be how many people showed up to vote and how many ballots do I have? That is step one. And it sounds really simple, but it's not. Because we don't just, in the old days, you walked in to the precinct, there was usually a book with names in it. They say, hey, there's Hans. Yes, go vote. Here's your ballot. Put it in the box. That was it. Now we've got provisional voting. Now we've got
countywide voting.
We've got countywide voting. We've got early voting. And countywide voting in Texas means I have no precinct, really. I'm assigned to a precinct, but I can vote anywhere. And then that ballot is then credited back to my precinct. So now I've got to chase this ballot around the county to figure out where it's supposed to be credited. It can be done. It's not that hard, but it's a challenge, right, from a record-keeping standpoint. One of the other things we got really attuned to quickly is how do we look at machines and satisfy folks that these machines are going through safeguards and procedures to ensure that they're not hacked. Because if you haven't heard, people think that our machines are hacked. So one thing we're trying to do is we're looking at machines, a sampling of machines that are used in the election, and we're building out timelines for them. Complete timelines, soup to nuts. We bought the machine. We tested the machine. We took it to the warehouse. It sat in the warehouse. We programmed the machine. We sent it to the location. It stayed in the location. Day 1, it had 0 votes. Day 2, so on and so forth. And it gets down to, even at the end of the election, we have a great process in Texas, a partial manual count, where we actually test some of the machines after the election. We say, here are the ballots. Let's count them by hand. Let's count a sample of them. Let's make sure those numbers match. And we're really trying to, in our audit, when we issue our report, we're going to lay that stuff out so the public can know, here's where it is, here's what they should be doing. In some cases, they're missing a record in the middle. That's not good. What happened there? Our counties continue to get better the more scrutiny we put on them. Just the fact that we are saying, hey, you might get audited, that makes people keep their records a little better because they know someone's looking at their work. So lots of challenges. It's fun. It's important work. And I think it's really, hopefully, driving some of the numbers we've seen that are, we don't have faith in our election. My goal is to take that number and make it where we have more faith in elections.
Chad, very interesting. And during the Q&A, I want to pick up on another aspect of your new job, and that is the legal requirements from the state and federal level, because I think that'd be important for people to think through.
Sure.
Hans?
Well, I want to thank my fellow panelists for coming all the way from Texas for this. Appreciate you being here since you're in the heart of this. Heritage published a paper not too long ago on coming up with standards for auditing elections. And what you all need to understand, as Cully mentioned, is audits are just, like I said, ubiquitous in the business world. And because of that, there are generally accepted auditing standards and generally accepted accounting practices that have been put together by all of the associations, individuals that engage in these kind of auditings. And those set out the standards that auditors have to meet to make sure they are objective, experienced, know what they're doing. But then also the accounting principles are what they look at when they examine a company, a charity, and its business activities and its finances. There's nothing like that in the election area. And the reason is that almost no one has been conducting election audits, which is a real failure in the election area. Now, ever since the 2020 election, there's been a lot of discussion about audits. And they're referred to in all different ways. We use the term forensic audits, but there doesn't seem to be any agreement on what exactly that means. Now, conducting a hand recount is not an audit, and yet I've heard it referred to as that. And what we're talking about is not the kind of limited audits that have been done. There are audits where they simply look at the equipment used to make sure it was functioning properly. There are process audits where they look at the procedures that administrators use to make sure they were following those procedures in handling voters and voter registration. There are legal compliance audits where they are looking at and making sure that election officials complied with all applicable state and federal laws. Those are all piecemeal audits. What needs to be done, what we believe needs to be done, are comprehensive, in-depth audits that look at what was going on before the election, during the election, and after the election. Let me give you an example of what I mean. If you do a hand recount of a particular election, and let's say the margin of victory was 1,000 votes. Well, doing a hand recount, you may recount it, and yep, margin of victory was 1,000 votes. The ballots were properly counted by the machines, but simply doing a recount doesn't tell you whether the ballots cast in that election were valid. And if, for example, as our election fraud database shows, there were 1,001 people who voted in that election who don't actually live in the state of Texas. They actually live in Oklahoma, but they got falsely registered to vote there, then you're not going to turn that up with a simple recount. What you should have done and need to do is a comprehensive audit of the voter registration list, and in particular, whether election officials, prior to the election, were taking all the steps necessary to make sure that it is an accurate list. They were verifying that the person who registered actually legally resides in the jurisdiction where they're voting, whether they're actually a citizen, whether they are not a felon, perhaps, whose ability to vote has been taken away. It's a whole series of things like that. How often have they checked, and do they do this right before the election? Do they compare the voter registration list with the Social Security Administration's master death index to find individuals who have died before the election? Again, anyone who thinks that's not a problem, we just added 2 election fraud cases to our database of individuals who cast ballots in the names of their deceased mothers. But that's the kind of thing you have to look at. And it is not, you know, I've heard some election officials who think this is not a good idea, it shouldn't happen, and I think they're just wrong. Because what we're trying to do in this situation is make sure the entire system was working properly. And as Senator Bettencourt says, find problems so we can fix them. But what's got to happen is states not only need to start doing this, but they've got to start developing the standards and principles. If you look at our paper, we've got 18 different areas that we think audits ought to look at through the entire election process. And I'll give you just a quick example of how I think this not only can fix problems, but can inspire greater public confidence in the elections. And that's something we all want to achieve. Is, look, in 2021, there was an audit done in New Hampshire, Windham, New Hampshire, because there were some claims that the vote count had not been properly done. So they did an in-depth audit. They hand recounted the ballots, and in fact, they found there was a 499 vote discrepancy. This was a small election state representative between the hand recount and the machine totals. The audit uncovered that this is a jurisdiction where you fill out paper ballots like so many folks do, and then it's scanned. They have a computer scanner to count it. Well, what they discovered was that election officials were using a folding machine. In other words, when someone requested an absentee ballot, they had a machine that folded the ballot so it could go into an envelope and be mailed to the voter. Well, the machine was folding the absentee ballot not in between candidates' names the way it was supposed to, but in many occasions it was creating the fold in the middle of the candidate's name. And so when the voters sent back the completed ballot, the computer scanner was misreading the ballot. In instances where the fold line had gone through the candidate's name, it would read it as a vote. And that would often lead to overvotes, which would void the ballot. Now, the 499 vote discrepancy did not change the outcome of that particular election. But the point of that audit was that they discovered the problem and could fix it and make sure it didn't happen in a future election where it might have made the difference in the election. So the opposition that I see from some folks on this is just totally misguided. And I will tell you, if the shareholders of General Motors were told that General Motors officers and corporate officials think that financial audits just aren't needed, that everyone should just trust that we never do anything wrong, we do things right, there would be an uprising. And that is the way I think the public should look at this issue too.
Well, in addition to an SEC and other investigations.
Exactly right,
yeah.
right.
Before I pepper you guys with some questions, how can folks find our voter fraud database?
If you go to the website of the Heritage Foundation, it's easily available on the first page, and it's a great it's a great web page. It's proven cases of fraud. So these are not allegations. These are folks who either been found guilty in a court of law or a judge has ordered a new election, and we're up to almost 1,400 cases, and we're following, I think, upwards of another 100 prosecutions going on around the country.
And if I could add, Kelly, to this, it's important about the margin of victory, and especially in these state rep races around the country. 499 votes may not have made a difference in New Hampshire, but in Harris County, which is the size of the 26th largest state of in the U.S., we've had state reps, and 2 years ago, one by 47, one by 114. There was a guy named Mike Jackson who won by 7 votes, and after a recount, he won by 5. That's why they called him Landslide Mike. Now, so when you get problems and you don't take care of them, eventually you can change the difference in these, especially these district races from coast to coast.
You had compared Harris County to a much smaller county in terms of population. What is your viewpoint regarding whether there should be national auditing standards developed, or whether there should be a county by county or state by state, or do you have an opinion on that?
I think national would be really hard, simply because of the many ways that we vote in this country. I mean, Oregon is all mail-in ballots, and they universal mail out the ballots and they come back in. That is a totally different system than what we have in Texas, where you have to apply for a mail-in ballot, you have to have a reason for a mail-in ballot, and it should be very limited. That we mostly vote in person. So, I think you need to recognize that we're federal. So I think different states need different standards. And even in Texas, I think it's hard to say because the counties are not the same. With my next round of audits that will start here after the election, we've got Eastland County, which is a very small county, and we've got Harris County, which is a very large county, and we've got a border county, which is much different than Harris County, much different than Eastland County. So I like that the election administrators in Texas can come up with policies and procedures that fit their counties, being that we're so diverse. And I don't want to mess that up by mandating things from the state. But there are certain minimums, and there are certain minimums you got to keep, and we can set the minimums. But we just hopefully we set it in a way where everyone doesn't race to the minimum and not do the extra.
If I could, let me add some Uncle Paul's top-down guidelines to this discussion, because I think you can do some top-down guidelines, which is really, if you look at GAAP, that's how it started. It's more voluminous now, but
GAAP are generally accepted accounting principles.
Right?
Yeah.
But incorrect reporting of daily results during early voting. That's what actually Harris County did, and that started a letter that was just sent and received from the forensic audit group at the Secretary of State. Singular polls saying open much later than other polls, electronic poll books providing incorrect and incomplete information, lack of chain of custody documentation for live ballots. This is so big in this letter that he sent out that it affects probably at least 140,000 votes cast out of Harris County, because there were 14 mobile ballot boxes that the chain of custody broke down on completely, and that's a huge problem. Poll workers not qualifying voters adequately, and the comment I made earlier, simple red flags of fraud, which does exist outside of voter irregularities, because what I listed earlier was voter irregularities. But if you have more votes in a precinct than voters that are registered in a precinct, you got a problem.
Right.
So recognize it.
Hans, do you agree with Chad's answer to should there be national or local standards?
I agree that there ought to be national minimums, but those all have to be customized according to the state, because we are the most decentralized election system of any of the Western democracies, and our elections are run by the states. The rules are different in every state, and so they have to be customized. But for example, remember, there's also generally accepted auditing standards that govern the auditors, that say they have to exercise independent judgment. They have to be experienced. That I think we can come up with. There we can come up with national standards. What are the standards that the persons use for auditing ought to meet? But when it comes to looking at the actual election process, the registering of voters, the voting, the tabulation, yeah, it's going to have to be customized.
So that brings up a point you made in your paper. It's the who does it and the how often does it. And I want to bring the three of you into that because you make the fox and the hen house observation. You can't have people who are conducting it audit themselves because that won't lend credibility or confidence to the voters that the people running the election are the ones auditing themselves. Share your thoughts on the who should do the auditing and how often. We'll start with you, Senator, and just work my way down the line.
Well, from a policymaker perspective, we started with the concept that it would be better to have a professional corps do the audit to start with, which in this case is Secretary of State Forensic Audit Division. The reason why we did it, Cully, is that you have to have some professional, acumen to Hans's point that you even know what you're looking at. Because if you hired a third-party accounting firm to do an audit, they don't really understand the regs and the laws, and especially whether they're violating federal and state code. So we decided that it would be better to start that division, and he's got 4 people with extensive experience. I'm happen to be, one of the few ex-election administrators that made it into a legislative position.
Mm-hmm.
And so that background is unusual, but it's also unusual to even have experienced people doing these audits. And when we first started this audit bill discussion, one of the first questions was, well, was this an Arizona style or is it a specific way of doing things? And it's different because the important thing is you've got to get that core function of audit, not be the people that are actually doing the work, but that have done the same type of work.
Mm-hmm.
Because otherwise you don't get people that can recognize the obvious. Because if you don't know what needs to be fixed or what the measurement is, you can't do it.
Chad, and if you could layer in the state and federal law piece too, that'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think Senator Bettencourt hit on something really important. It was really important to me to get on staff some former elections administrators in Texas and former election officials that have been in counties doing this stuff, because I will tell you, it is real easy to get some of this data in and get the wrong idea really quickly and come to wrong conclusion. And it's been so important to have that core or down there I can say, hey, Carla, have you seen this in your county before? What's going on here? Oh, yeah, Chad, it's this. And okay, fine. So that's been so important to us. And I think that, as Hans said, some standards on who we need on our teams is super important. And I think and I want to go back to something Senator Bettencourt said actually when he had his piece of paper out. I think one of our biggest problems for election integrity, and from what we're seeing, is that a lot of our election administrators are back in a 2016 mindset, where before kind of we got this scrutiny on elections, and we see them, we have deadlines built into the code. You have to have this posted on the internet by 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock. And you see they get, oh no, we'll just post the data online. Well, that's bad data. And then you've posted online, and what do we know? If it's online forever, and it's wrong. And we see this a lot where we have bad data out there, and then the real data I will get eventually, but the bad data is out there. And I think election administrators have been chastised enough by their grassroots, deservedly, and they're realizing, wait, we can't put this out. We got to get it right. And that's been a big thing without the audits, even, that the grassroots has shown us.
Hans, and then back to the senator.
Well, I agree with all that. Obviously, if you're conducting an audit of alias Smith County, you can't have the people who run elections in alias Smith County auditing themselves. So you've got to have a core of folks, but they've got to have election experience. The big problem in this area right now, which is not a problem in the business area, is because audits in the business area have been done for so long and are so standard, there's a whole huge group of auditors out there, experienced auditors, independent auditors that can be hired by companies an organization to do their audits, and there's nothing like that. But if states start requiring the kind of audits that we're all talking about, that industry is quickly going to establish itself, because all of these election officials, experienced people around the country, as they start to retire or leave what they're doing, they're all going to, if there's a business opportunity there, they're going to start these kind of auditing firms, which means that hopefully state offices like Chad's will eventually have a group of folks out there in the private field who they can pull in on their teams to help them with these audits, but who have the kind of experience they want as election officials. You know, if Senator Bettencourt ever leaves the Senate, see, he'd be the perfect kind of guy for doing these kind of audits.
Is enough. I've got too many jobs. Kelly, you made a good point about the legal requirements and asking Chad about this. He had to release a letter this week that he probably can't talk about, but I will. But it's to tell the largest county in Texas, Harris County, effectively follow the law, because you've got to keep these records for 22 months. Okay, and that's been, you know, part of federal and state law for quite some time. It's kind of settled law, but they didn't keep it. In fact, the previous election administrator, the one that's now, wouldn't even have his people talk to the state audit team, or she wouldn't. And the important part of that discussion was they couldn't even replicate the software that actually read these 14 missing mobile ballot boxes just 2 years later. Now, so this is a big warning shot that says don't do it again. And it's backed up by sending additional election administrators and people embedded with the Attorney General if necessary. The problem we're in right now is that there's so many questions about voting and election equipment. Some people aren't sure if you had a DRE, just electronic only.
What's DRE?
Direct recording equipment, okay? Most places have a hybrid where you have a paper ballot and a direct recorder. That's what we use in Texas. That's why the hand count is not really an audit, okay, if everything goes well. But even then, you have to have the ability to go back and say, you know, I followed these electronic boards effectively from the where in the poll all the way to central count. There's no break in the chain of custody, because again, what Harris County did was 14 of these MMBs,
What's an MMB?
Mobile ballot boxes that have, by my estimation, probably a conservative 140,000 votes on it. Then there's no chain of custody documentation. And I'm not even sure that they're the same serial numbers that started at the polling place that made it the central count. Now, this means it's not best practices. At minimum, it has to be fixed. So it was, I think, a very good step to say, don't do it. That's really what the letter started out saying with the new elections administrator. But there's a lot of recalcitrant responses. Like the same county got selected randomly for another audit, 2 out of 20, so they had a 10% chance. They filed a suit, said the randomness is obviously, you know, set up. And they literally went to the state court. I'm not making this up. Okay, so all right. So now that we know that they had a terrible chain of custody problem in 2020, I call on them to withdraw their suit. Have the commissioner's court pull that down. There's no reason to have a lawsuit when you can't even operate under state and federal code, and you're saying that I'm being unfairly treated by a random audit. It's time for everybody to put their cards on the table, get the problem measured, and then get it fixed.
Let me start with you about a different question, Hans. I have 2 more before I open it up to the audience. Years ago, when you were writing about the common sense idea that people should have an ID when they vote, the critics were saying, oh, that's vote suppressor, it's racist, and it's going to drive down the number of people who have access and won't vote. In fact, the opposite has happened.
Right.
We've seen that people will come out in droves now. When you wrote this paper, what have been the major criticisms, and what's your response to that in terms of whether this will make people not want to vote or increase people's confidence in the vote once it's been audited?
Well, there have been some critics, I think misinformed, saying that audits are going to somehow increase the lack of confidence that polling shows a lot of voters have in elections. I think the exact opposite is true. You know, if you do an audit and it comes out totally clean, what could be better for the confidence of the public in that area in the election? And if it comes out and it points out problems like what happened in the Windham, New Hampshire thing I was talking about, one, the audit showed it didn't affect the election, but second, it showed the public that they had found a problem and they fixed it.
So get rid of that folding machine.
Yeah.
Or make the folding machine work right.
Right. So people know, well, in the next election, that's not going to be a problem. So in fact, I think it's going to increase confidence in the election process. Just very quickly, one thing we didn't really answer was your question about how often and when they should be done. How many counties does Texas have?
254.
Yeah,
sorry,
54.
Steal
my answer. I knew that
No,
one.
no, sorry. It's not an answer. That's good. See, we've audited ourselves.
Right.
Right.
And there's a lot of counties that have, a lot of states that have also very large numbers of counties. It's impractical. There's no way that you could audit every single county after every election. You just can't do it. And so what I think states have to come up with is a system where, as I think Texas did, you have to audit a certain number of counties randomly chosen after every election. And the best thing I think to do is to come up with a system, figure out what's practical. How many counties can you audit after an election? And then come up with a system to ensure that every county in the state is audited at least once every, 3 years, 5 years, whatever, from a practical standpoint, you can get it done. In Texas, that might be even that would be
Good
difficult.
news, Chad's budget just quadrupled.
Yeah.
Okay,
Right.
Okay, that's right.
I've become a bureaucrat, and it's expanding right away.
That's right. Well, and to Hans's point, this is a fulcrum position you have to pick as a policymaker, because we started off with urban counties having a much higher ratio than rural counties or suburban counties. And that's important because that's you look for where the votes are, and then you try to allocate your resources. But with all of this, you have to recognize the obvious, that you do want to have those audits done. And the difference in the legislation and planning and filing in the future is, besides these random audits, we're going to have effectively audits based upon merit, a request that really has been vetted not only at the local level, but at the Secretary of State level, that if there's an issue that's not being responded to, like why are there 579 registered voters at one house in Wichita Falls, okay, then if you can't get an answer, then it's time to go in and do an audit of that one, precinct. It may not be the audit of the entire roll. And that's how you spread your resources around.
Let me pick up on a comment that was made just a few minutes ago. As a businessman, I'm just used to my company being audited every year. And I count on a clean audit, because then it gives confidence to the shareholders. And every business person watching this is like, well, of course, obviously, no duh, right? But voting is, by definition, a political act. Not in the pejorative term, but it's just a political act. It's an expression of your First Amendment rights to choose who's going to represent you. How do we, to the extent practicable, depoliticize audits? So, for example, I'm sure there are people watching this that are going to say, oh, this is a Republican state, and these are Republicans who are trying to audit and kick Democrats out, or people who should be allowed to vote. And similarly, if there was an audit in Chicago of the votes, some Republicans, others may say, well, we can't trust that because this is the fox guarding the hen house. How do we convince both sides that they're wrong and move it to the point where business people look at their audit as just, this is just part of the business of being in the business, and here being in the business of voting, and increasing the confidence of everyone around the country that the vote is the vote and it was done right?
I think, right now, it's pretty clear that the Republican side is the one demanding audits and are mad. If you look back to 2016, who was thinking the election was stolen? It was the Democrats.
Or 2000. 2000.
In 2000,
Right,
2016. In 2016, you actually see a very big bump. There's one poll I saw that 70% of all Americans in 2016 thought the election lacked honesty. That's a staggering number, and that's bipartisan. So I think what's going to happen is that the pendulum needs to swing, and both sides need to go through a round of losses, and then I think everyone will come around to it because it's something that needs to be done. You know, whether you're left or right, center, whatever, you want a fair process. And you know, at this point, you know, when you win, you're always happy. Ah, that was a perfect election. That was great. But when you lose, then it's like, well, maybe it wasn't so perfect. So I think it's going to take a little bit of swinging in elections before we get everyone on board.
Do you hire any Democrats in your office, or do you even care what party they're
I
part of?
don't care. I have no idea what the political persuasion of any of my employees are. And what's interesting is when people come to me and talk about what we do, they always come to me, how many votes are you finding? Votes and votes and votes. We never say the word vote around the office. We're looking at ballots. And when I'm talking about reconciliation between how many people showed up and how many, I'm talking about ballots. And so whatever the votes are what the votes are. But from an auditing perspective, you're all about ballots. You're not about votes.
I assume, I don't know, that you plan to be as transparent as you can and put things out there for the public to see. The messed up folding machine that you find in one county or something else, right?
Yes, when we issue our report, we're going to have the background ad nauseum. It's probably going to be too much background in layers. My IT made me do this the other day, and we looked how much data I actually have from the 4 counties I'm auditing right now, and it's over half a terabyte.
Yeah.
It was closer to 600. Those are gigabytes. Yeah. Right. So the amount of data. So I think part of it, my job is going to be how do I get the key documents out there for everyone to look at without gumming up the system with, you know, extra.
Focus on the depolitization question.
I just did this interview this morning back to Houston, okay, because it was the exact same question. And what everybody's got to understand, that this is sunshine. What an audit is sunshine. It's transparency. And if you see it, you can believe it. Now, for example, he's sending in elections, personnel into Harris County, but we've had election inspectors in every major urban county, whether they've been Republican-controlled or Democrat-controlled, for as long as I can remember, because I actually I did that job back in the 1990s. But right now it's an affront, because everything's an affront. If you're being audited, oh, it's an affront. Well, no, it's just the search for truth. But importantly, it's a way for good best practices to be propagated to other places and mistakes to be corrected for the future election. And we've got to get out of this situation where we are now in politics of you can't ask a question. Because right now, the froth is so high that you can't ask a question about election procedure without being somebody taking offense either from the left or the right. But the bottom line is questions are good, answers are better, results are what matters. That's really what audits are. And it's going to take, Kelly, it's going to be a real reprogramming of the body electorate, because the real problem is this. Everything moves so at instantaneous light speed now. And it's more easy to criticize than it is to agree. And we have to change this in elections. So my challenge is to do that, okay, with the audit bill presentations that I'm making. And I've had people come up and say, I would agree with you, except I'm not your political party. I said, well, how about just agreeing with the concept? And it's going to take a lot of effort to get past it.
I suspect, Chad, and I don't know, that over time, once this takes root and you start institutionalizing best practices, et cetera, you're going to share those best practices with any state that asks, number one. Number two, you're going to uncover things that cut both ways politically. And I think over time that will drive up confidence on both sides of the aisle, at least in a utopian way, hopefully.
Yeah, I think so. The data is what the data is, and
right.
It's going to cut both ways. Cheating is not, or mistakes, cheating and mistakes are not partisan. They happen both ways.
They're human.
We have examples in our voter fraud database of Republicans cheating, Democrats cheating, independents cheating.
Right.
And these are all convictions
Right.
in a court of law around the country. Hans,
Right.
let me turn to you with a depolitization question, and then we're going to leave the last 10 minutes for audience questions.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I think the key to that is the reason that we published that paper at the Heritage Foundation is you have to develop, this is a totally untested area because it just hasn't been done. And what you do is you develop professional standards, professional principles that I think it's hard to disagree with on some kind of partisan basis. And then you put together the kind of professional staffs that Chad has put together to enforce and follow those standards and principles. And when you're doing that, I think it's pretty hard for somebody to claim that you're somehow acting in a
I want to
political
emphasize
manner.
one thing that Hans did in his paper and what we've talked about here. Voter ID was extremely controversial. When I came here in 2006 to testify, the House Administration Committee filled up like that, and because it was a flashpoint. Now, everybody knows that photo ID does not stop turnout. In fact, there's no case in the United States that I know of where a state that's adopted it has had problems with turnout. And in fact, in Texas, we're expecting a record turnout of approximately 10 million people. The vote, which is astonishing, and it's great news. It means the democracy is healthy, whether the democracy itself realizes it, okay? Because it's a political act, as you said before, so people get a choice. This audit situation is the same thing. In the future, it's going to be commonplace, and everybody's going to agree with it. But it's going to take time to get there.
Any final words before I turn it over to the audience?
One thing I think what I've seen is we've gotten into this process, and now we've started with 4, and we're going to have 4 more, and talking to these election administrators, that there's some reticence at first, but then once we talk and have our initial meeting, it's usually like, and this is my chance as an election administrator to show I'm doing things right. And I may make mistakes, you're going to find it, and if we made a mistake, we'll own it. But this is an opportunity. The audit is an opportunity to show that, as the election administrator, I do a pretty good job, and I can tell my commissioner's court and my voters that, hey, in this county, you can be happy and respect the results of the election.
And you have a website. People can go to it. How can they get there to your website?
It's on the Secretary of State's website. There's a little link there. It says the Forensic Audit Divisions under elections.
And people will be over time will be able to find all sorts of stuff.
Yes, it's pretty sparse now, but we're getting there.
Right. Good. All right, so this is your chance to ask any of these 3 experts a question, and my only request and demand is that you actually ask a question, not speechify, because as a former judge, can just cut you off if you do that. So raise your hand.
Between a judge and a federal prosecutor, I'm in trouble. Help me.
If anyone, the gentleman in the front, hold on, we're going to bring a microphone so that the people online can hear your question.
I know you've been very nice about saying this happens on both sides. From watching television in the last election, I got the impression it was pretty heavily on one side, not both sides equal. So this kind of symmetry you're talking about, is that really the case, or are you just saying that to kind of help be political and get this through the process?
Well, I don't know which one of us said that exactly, but look, the fact of the matter is he's got prosecutions documented of multiple parties, okay? And people make stupid mistakes, and they do stuff like this in every state in the union. The question is, what do you do about it? What I'm trying to do is make it clear, like in my audit bill, I started before the election of 2020 asking questions in October when the vote totals didn't match. So it wasn't because of President Trump's election, because he actually won Texas. It didn't matter. There was already a problem. So we're going to recognize it. Look, and I'm also, I made somebody thought it was a mistake when I first got elected tax assessor. I went to Commissioner's Court and said, I want a performance audit because I came from business. And everybody said, you're crazy. That's always a bad thing for anybody to get done as an audit. It turned out to be a great roadmap to modernize an office that was stuck in the 19th century. Okay. And then we became the first county to have online tax payments, online vehicle registration, et cetera. So when I say that right now, I'm stuck in a problem where in Harris County, there were Republicans like me that used to be in charge of elections. Now there's not. But we can't ask questions without it being almost a national news story that this is a denier. So I'm trying to recognize the obvious and say this will eventually be both sides will agree this is the right thing to do. But the vote on the audit bills was 100% partisan, and I actually even lost one Republican because they thought it was an unfunded mandate. Now, but recognize the obvious. What gets measured gets fixed.
Question here in the front.
Thank you. Excellent panel on an incredibly important topic. Hans, your paper touches on the fact that there are lots of different kinds and forms of audits. Right. One of the ones which has caught in fire recently is risk limiting audit. There are lots of states that have deployed this either in full or as a pilot program. Can you all talk about your views on risk limiting audits? Are they sufficient in the election context to solve the issues that you guys are talking about? Do you need to do more? Are there limits to risk limiting audits? No pun intended.
And Jason Sneed's question requires you to tell people what that is first, and then explain your answer. What is a risk limiting audit?
You want to start with that?
So risk limiting audits are a specific type of audit that are kind of triggered by statistics, and
Right.
and how deep you go into the audit is a function of how close the race is. And I think they're a good tool. We have them in Texas. We've got a pilot program going right now. Is it 6 counties? I can't remember.
Right.
I think it's 6 counties.
Right.
And then after 2026, I think it goes statewide.
Right.
So we're going to be doing that. I think it's a different tool. It will tell you it's closer to a recount than what I'm doing, which is a more comprehensive dive into the records. So it's a tool. I think it's a useful tool. I think we'll see here, hopefully in a couple months with our pilot program, how good of a tool it is. So
We have 3 minutes left, so quick answer, and perhaps another question.
Narrow tool, okay, and what forensic audits does, that gets you the problems, the tough ones to solve. That's why you need to have that as an option.
Again, a risk limiting audit, it may tell you that the votes are being properly counted in one of the random precincts chosen, but it doesn't tell you whether those votes were cast by individuals who were eligible to vote, for example.
All right. One question here in the front, right here.
Hi there. Let's talk about enforcement a little bit. So it's one thing to have transparency and sunlight, but let's take the example of the anonymous county you had to write a letter to. Let's say that recalcitrance continues. You have commissioners who are not willing to abide by the procedures you're setting, or who routinely are audited and found wanting. You're in the Secretary of State, you're not in the AG's office. What kind of enforcement mechanisms exist to overcome either recalcitrance or just continual failure?
Well, we have sunshine, and I think that does a lot. Shame does a lot, and we have that. But our tools, I think, I'll let him preview the next session on tools.
Well, and that's exactly why you do have to be able to take things either to a civil penalty or to a criminal penalty. Now, in the bill that we're going to come back with, there will be civil penalties for violation of the law as determined by Secretary of State. There's also criminal prosecution. In Texas, that's a DA by county decision right now. So the question will be whether or not to have that in either an alternate form or surrounding counties or statewide, et cetera. But you're right. I think one of the important points is some people are unwilling to respond, some people are unable to respond. Now, you can fix some of this, but if they are unwilling to respond, then you have to be able to either fine them, and that was in my bill, because and it's going to be in that bill again, and we'll have some also more enhanced ability to do more prosecution. I hate to say that, but there's just no reason for, as an election administrator, in my experience, if you're either going to follow state and federal law or you're not. It's real simple. And if you've made a mistake, just fix it, get it done, and move on. And that's what we need to see more of. And we shouldn't be afraid of the fact that, yes, You know, if you're not violating, if you're violating the law, you're gonna have consequences for it. We've already passed one bill that if you don't clean up the voter roll, that was one of mine, Senate Bill 1113, the Secretary of State can withhold your money on voter roll cleanup, because we're trying to enforce good business behavior or best practices, which is clean up the voter roll.
All right, well,
Just-
Hans, let me
just-
give you the
just-
last word.
Just one quick thing on this. I certainly agree with that, but one of the other things that I think states need to look at, and it's something we talk about in the paper, is you have to put in an enforcement mechanism so that the election officials in a particular county will cooperate with the auditors and provide them with data and information, documents, whatever. And if they don't do that, then you've got to have some kind of either administrative fines system or even possible suspension or termination of employment, because they've got to cooperate with the auditors.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion, and please join me in thanking our panelists. We're adjourned.